It began on one of those July nights that never cool down. Akron, 1975. The air was thick with factory smoke and the smell of hot asphalt. By late evening, East Market Street had emptied, the hum of machinery fading into a restless quiet. It was a night like any other until, at 10:47 p.m., a scream echoed near the Cuyahoga River and disappeared into the dark. That scream belonged to 21-year-old Karen Ellison. Karen worked nights at Benny's Corner Cafe, a small diner where everyone knew her by name. She was known for her kindness, the kind of person who always walked home even when offered a ride. On July 18th, she clocked out at 10:28 p.m., waved goodbye to her coworker, and stepped into the heavy summer air. She never made it home. By morning, her absence worried everyone. The diner called her apartment, but no one answered. Her landlord checked the unit. The bed made, the lights off. Her purse and keys were missing. When her father arrived from Barberton, he reported her missing within the hour. Posters appeared by noon. That same afternoon, a jogger found a purse scattered on the ground along the Cuyahoga River Trail. Karen's wallet and keys inside, perfectly intact. Within hours, Akron police swarmed the area. By nightfall, flashlights sliced through the trees until one beam caught something pale under the maples. Karen was found face down near the water's edge. Her dress torn, her hands scraped, her body bruised from a violent struggle. Detective Frank Wilcox arrived minutes later. Whoever did this knew the trail, he would later write. But clues were scarce. No weapon. No footprints clear enough to trace. Nothing except a cigarette, but beside her body, a Viceroy brand. Karen didn't smoke. The cigarette was collected and sealed in an evidence bag, one of 12 items tagged before midnight. In 1975, that meant little. DNA wasn't yet part of police language. The case depended on witnesses, confessions, or luck. Over the next weeks, the investigation spread thin. Detectives questioned more than 50 people, including a truck driver who'd stopped for coffee that night and a factory worker seen near the trail. None matched. Rumors started spinning. A drifter, a jealous ex-lover, even an out-of-town salesman. Nothing stuck. The case hit a dead end. Local papers called it the River Trail murder. For months, Akron lived in quiet fear. Women carried whistles. Men drove their daughters home after dusk. The Ellison family pleaded on television for help, their father's voice shaking as he said, "She didn't deserve to die alone." His words became a kind of echo, one that lingered long after reporters moved on. By autumn, Karen's file sat in a cabinet at the Akron Police Department, stamped cold. Her parents buried her in Riverside Cemetery, beneath a simple headstone marked only with her name and the year. Each July 18th, her father left flowers by the river. He never stopped visiting, even when hope felt pointless. Time moved on, but the city never forgot. The factories that once fed Akron's economy shut down, leaving skeleton buildings and faded billboards. Families left, others stayed and watched the past decay around them. And somewhere in the noise of everyday life, someone carried the weight of a secret. Decades passed. By 2024, the murder was a footnote, one of hundreds gathering dust in the archives. But that same year, the Akron Cold Case Unit was revived under a new initiative, Project Revisit. The goal was clear: reopen unsolved murders using modern technology. Most cases yielded nothing new. But sometimes, evidence that had once meant nothing began to speak again. Lieutenant Emma Draper, 38, had a reputation for patient focus. She wasn't chasing glory. She wanted truth. On a warm April morning, while combing through index boxes, she found Karen Ellison's case file, brittle, coffee-stained, and forgotten. Inside were photographs, witness notes, and a small bag labeled item number 12, cigarette, but Viceroy brand. It caught her eye because it was physical, something that could now tell a story through science. Draper had seen miraculous recoveries before, fibers producing matches decades later, DNA from degraded samples solving impossible puzzles. She decided to test the sample, knowing it might yield nothing. But it didn't yield nothing. 6 weeks later, the call came from the state lab. "We got a profile," the technician said. Draper asked for the name twice, making sure she heard correctly. Thomas Breckner. Male. Born 1952. Residing in Akron. She froze. Breckner was 73, no criminal record, no prior arrests, no flag behavior. A retired machinist. A quiet man living in a tidy one-story house on South Howard Street, not far from where Karen had disappeared. In 1975, his address placed him just 6 blocks from the diner where she worked. At first, Draper assumed it was a mistake, maybe cross-contamination, maybe a distant relative. But the lab tested twice. The DNA from that Viceroy cigarette matched on every marker. Her team began digging deeper. Breckner's old employment records showed he'd worked night shifts at a factory nearby. He drove a dark blue Chevrolet at the time, the same type witnesses claimed to have seen parked near the trail that summer. It was circumstantial, yes, but uncomfortably close. When Draper shared the results with her supervisor, the station fell silent. No one wanted to believe that a man who'd lived peacefully among them for half a century might have carried this secret. A few detectives even remembered him loosely, a polite mechanic, a helpful neighbor. No history of violence. But the science didn't care. That night, Draper sat at her desk and reopened the evidence photos, the old, grainy Polaroids of Karen Ellison. She studied the shadows, the marks on her hands, the quiet sadness of a case that had waited almost 50 years for someone to simply look deeper. Outside the window, rain started falling, steady, cold, filling the streets with the same kind of silence that must have blanketed that trail in 1975. By midnight, she'd written one line in her report: DNA match confirmed. Suspect Thomas Breckner to be interviewed. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling light, wondering how many years of someone's life could vanish into a single mistake, and how many decades it might take to pay for it. Somewhere not too far away, in a quiet house with a faded porch and wind chimes that never stopped ringing, a 73-year-old man was closing his curtains, unaware that the past had finally caught up with him. And this time, Akron was ready to listen. The file sat untouched for nearly half a century. Layers of dust covered its brown folder. The spine faded from years inside a steel cabinet. If you open it, the paper smelled like smoke and age, a reminder that time had almost buried the truth. Until Lieutenant Emma Draper decided to break the seal. It was June 2025 when she reopened the Ellison file for the second time. The DNA results were clear, but clarity and conviction were different things. Draper knew that linking Thomas Breckner to the crime through science wasn't enough. She needed to map the story, connect every fact that could still speak after 50 years of silence. The station was quiet that afternoon. Only the low hum of computers and the ticking of the old wall clock filled the air. Draper laid the evidence photos neatly across her desk, the black and white images of the crime scene and the uneven handwriting of original reports. Beside them sat the DNA confirmation sheet, like a ghost written in digital ink. Breckner's record was remarkably blank. No assaults, no arrests, not even a traffic citation in the last 20 years. But buried in an old employment directory, Draper found something small but significant. In 1975, Breckner had worked at the Summit Machine Works factory just off East Market Street, less than a mile from the diner where Karen Ellison worked. It was the first solid point of contact. She requested his historical employment records, phone directories from the era, and old incident logs from the factory's security. Each piece of paper began to reveal traces of a man who had once been invisible. A quiet worker, not social, always took the late shifts. Her partner, Detective Joe Kramer, leaned over her desk one evening, scrolling through the digitized records. Half the city worked at Summit back then, he said, skeptical. We'll need more than proximity. Draper didn't argue. She turned another page from the original witness report. A name she'd barely noticed before resurfaced. Eileen Castor, 23, gas station attendant. Last interviewed July 22nd, 1975. The line beneath her name contained a note by Detective Wilcox. Claims to remember a man with grease on his hands buying a towel night of incident. Draper read it aloud. Kramer frowned. That's your guy. Maybe, she said. It's one of the only specific descriptions in here. They tracked down the old address of the gas station, now an abandoned lot near Arlington Road. But the archives contained a surprise, an updated address for Eileen Castor, now Eileen Morris, living in a retirement complex just outside Akron. Draper didn't wait. She made the call. Eileen's voice was frail but sharp when she answered. When Draper mentioned the case, there was a long pause. "I didn't think anyone would ever ask again," she said. 2 days later, they met at the retirement home. The room smelled of lavender and old paper. Draper placed 2 photographs on the table. Karen Ellison on one side, a driver's license photo of Thomas Breckner on the other. Eileen stared at Breckner's face for several minutes before nodding. "Yes, I remember him," she whispered. "That night, he came in a little before midnight, asking for a towel. Said he spilled oil, but his hands looked darker than oil. He looked shaken. I offered paper towels. He wouldn't take them. Just bought 1 dish rag and left fast." It was the first eyewitness recollection that tied Breckner to that night. Even after 50 years, her memory held enough detail to freeze the room. Draper thanked her, collected her notes carefully, and stepped outside into the afternoon light, the corners of her mind already aligning the puzzle pieces. Later that week, Draper and Kramer set up surveillance. Breckner's schedule was predictable. Grocery store every Tuesday, morning walks around his neighborhood, yard work on weekends. He kept to himself. There was a stillness about him, too calm, almost rehearsed. From across the street, Draper would watch him water his flowers. He looked harmless. That fact unsettled her the most. Evil rarely looked like a monster. It looked like the man who said good morning to his neighbors. One afternoon, she asked a question that cut through the warm silence inside the police van. "What do you think he tells himself when he looks in the mirror?" Kramer shrugged. "Probably nothing. People like that don't think they did anything wrong anymore. They just erase it." She nodded, but said nothing, focusing instead on the man with the watering can, the one whose name was about to drag half a century of pain into the present. The interview was scheduled quietly. No press, no leaks. October 1st, 2025. Draper and Kramer arrived at his house just after sunrise. The neighborhood still felt half asleep, curtains drawn, birds waking. Breckner opened the door after the second knock, wearing a flannel shirt and glasses. He looked surprised but not alarmed. "Mr. Breckner?" Draper asked. "We'd like to talk to you about a matter from 1975. He hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in," he said. His voice was steady, polite. Inside, the home was neat but dated, crocheted curtains, a ticking grandfather clock, framed family photos. They sat at the kitchen table, coffee brewing in the background. Draper began carefully, asking about his work at Summit Machine Works, his routine back in the 70s. He answered without hesitation, calm, controlled. Then she brought up Karen Ellison. For the first time, something shifted. His eyes flickered downward. "I don't know that name," he said. "You lived less than a mile from her workplace," Kramer prompted. "That ring any bells?" "No," Breckner replied quickly. "That was a long time ago." Draper placed a photo of the evidence bag on the table, the Viceroy cigarette, but forensic analysis matched your DNA, she said softly. It was found right next to her body. The silence that followed felt endless. Breckner leaned back in his chair, staring at the picture, his jaw tightening. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, lower, almost resigned. "I smoked back then," he said. "Half the city did." "Maybe," Draper replied, "but only one person's DNA was there." She watched him struggle to find an answer. His hands trembled, his breathing grew shallow. And then came a phrase so quiet it was almost swallowed by the hum of the refrigerator. "That was a long time ago," he said again. But this time, it wasn't denial. It was confession disguised as memory. Outside, the morning light broke over the neighborhood as the 2 detectives stepped off his porch. "We've got him," Kramer murmured. "Not yet," Draper said. "But we will." That afternoon, the Akron Police Department quietly issued a warrant for Thomas Breckner's arrest, citing newly confirmed forensic evidence and corroborating witness testimony. Within 24 hours, local media got the tip. Days later, national outlets would too. But at that moment, that exact Friday evening, only one thing mattered. After 50 silent years, the city that had forgotten finally began to remember. The wind outside carried a chill from the river, the same one that had hidden the truth for half a century. For the first time in a lifetime, justice wasn't just a word whispered in grief. It was walking toward their door. October 3rd, 2025. The morning fog hung low over Akron, muting the skyline, turning the city into shades of gray. Inside the police department, the building felt heavier than usual. For the first time in 50 years, the man behind the city's most haunting cold case was about to speak. Lieutenant Emma Draper sat in the small interview room, notebook closed, eyes fixed on the empty chair opposite her. Detective Joe Kramer leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You look nervous," he said quietly. "I'm not," Draper replied. "Just focused." At 9:03 a.m., the door opened. Two officers led in Thomas Breckner. At 73, he looked small inside his oversized jacket, gray hair combed neatly, eyes tired but alert. He nodded politely as he sat down. "Good morning, Mr. Breckner," Draper began. "I'm Lieutenant Draper. This is Detective Kramer." He cleared his throat. "You said this is about a case from a long time ago." "Yes," Draper said, pushing a photograph across the table. "Do you recognize this woman?" Karen Ellison's smiling face stared up at him. He looked longer than expected, then turned his eyes away. "No. Should I?" "She was murdered near the Cuyahoga River on July 18, 1975. You lived 6 blocks from where she was last seen." He blinked slowly. "A lot of people lived near there." Draper kept her tone steady. "Your shift at Summit Machine Works ended that night at 10:04 p.m. Karen left the diner at 10:28. The route she took home ran past your street." "That was 50 years ago," he said. "You think I'd remember something from then?" "We don't expect memory," Draper replied. "We expect the truth." She placed another photo on the table, an old evidence tag showing the Viceroy cigarette but sealed in plastic. "This was found beside her body. Your DNA matches perfectly." He stared at the image. "That's crazy. Half the city smoked Viceroys." "Only one person's DNA was on it," she said. Silence filled the room. The clock ticked, sharp and relentless. Breckner rubbed his thumb across his palm, avoiding their eyes. Kramer leaned forward. "We also spoke to a woman who worked at the gas station near Arlington. Said you stopped in that night, bought a towel. Hands were dirty, looked like blood." Breckner's head jerked up, eyes narrowing. "She remembered that?" "She did," Draper said. 5 decades later. A twitch crossed his cheek. He sighed and looked down again. "You really think dragging me in here will change anything?" "Yes," Draper said softly. "For her family. For this city. For you." For a few moments, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something low and resigned. "She screamed." Kramer sat up straight. "Who screamed?" "The girl," Breckner whispered. "Karen." Draper's pulse jumped. She kept still, giving him space to continue. "She was walking alone. I followed her, don't know why. Maybe I just wanted to talk. She turned around, saw me, started yelling. I tried to calm her down. I grabbed her arm. She fought me, kicked. I didn't mean to hurt her." His hands shook. "I hit her once. She fell. It was fast. She stopped moving. I froze. I panicked. Then I ran." "You left her there?" Draper asked quietly. He nodded. "I told myself someone would find her. I burned my shirt, washed my hands. I thought if I kept my head down, no one would ever know." Kramer's voice stayed even. "But you knew." "Yeah," Breckner said, eyes wet. "You don't forget something like that. You just bury it, day after day, until it feels like someone else's life." Draper turned on the recorder. "To confirm for the record," she said, "you're admitting involvement in the death of Karen Ellison on July 18, 1975? He nodded again, barely audible. "Yes, I did it." The sound of those words filled the room. Draper wrote them in her notes, then closed the file carefully. "Thomas Breckner, you're under arrest for the murder of Karen Ellison. You have the right to remain silent." He interrupted. "I stayed silent long enough." 2 officers stepped in to escort him out. He didn't fight. As they cuffed his wrists, his shoulders lowered, depleted of 50 years of denial. Before exiting the room, he looked once at Draper. "She was kind," he whispered. "Tell them I'm sorry." Outside, clouds thickened and rain began to fall. Through the narrow window, Draper watched Breckner being guided down the steps to a waiting vehicle. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted his name. Kramer joined her, slipping his hands into his pockets. "You believe him?" "I believe the evidence," Draper said. Her voice sounded tired, older. But the truth's never the same thing as justice. They stood there, listening to the faint rumble of thunder rolling over the rooftops. The van doors closed, and the sound of the locks snapping shut echoed through the parking lot. 50 years of hiding, Kramer muttered. "And this is how it ends." "No," Draper said. "This is how it begins." She walked back into the interview room once everyone was gone. The chair Breckner had sat in was still warm. On the table lay the small photograph of Karen, edges worn from decades of storage. Draper looked at it for a long time. She thought about the moment Breckner said her name, how it didn't sound angry or cruel, just broken. The truth had been locked behind his silence for half a century, waiting for 2 breaths, one of guilt, one of courage. Now it was finally out. In her report later that night, Draper wrote in neat, careful penmanship, *, suspect confessed to involvement. Motive unplanned. Expressed remorse, *. The line that followed wasn't standard. Justice, delayed, is still justice. She closed the case file slowly, sealing it in a new envelope marked reopened. Then she turned off the lamp, leaving only the dim hall light to spill across the empty table. Out in the quiet night, the rain fell harder, washing across the sidewalks, down the drains, into the same river that had once carried so many secrets. This time, it felt like the city itself was letting go, not forgetting, never forgiving, but finally breathing again. It rained through the night after the confession. The city that had carried the memory of Karen Ellison's murder seemed to weep with it. Streets glistened under streetlights. Puddles reflected the faint glow of neon signs from downtown bars closing late. For half a century, Akron had forgotten how to breathe under the weight of an unsolved killing. Now, one signature on a warrant promised to change everything. At 6:30 a.m., Lieutenant Emma Draper stood outside the county courthouse as officers prepared for the official booking. The storm had passed, but the air was still heavy, thick with the kind of quiet that follows a reckoning. In her hand, she held the original case file, its rusted staples replaced, its pages now slightly bent from overuse. The name at the top, Karen Ellison, July 18, 1975, had never seemed heavier. Inside, the city prosecutor paced the hallway. "We charge him today," he said. "Murder in the second degree. DNA confession. The witness should be open and shut." Draper nodded, but didn't smile. "There's no open and shut in something this old," she said. "There's just the truth finally seeing daylight." By 8, Breckner was processed through intake. The press had already arrived, jostling for camera angles. A crowd had gathered along the street, some curious, others somber. Among them stood people old enough to remember the summer of 1975, the fear that gripped their neighborhoods, the endless rumors about the girl found by the river. When the van door opened, flashbulbs flared. Breckner stepped out slowly, wrists cuffed, flanked by 2 deputies. His face was expressionless, but his eyes darted toward the noise. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Murderer!" Another voice followed, quieter. Finally, he didn't respond. He just stood there for a moment, rain dripping from his gray hair, until an officer urged him forward toward the courthouse steps. Inside, the bail hearing lasted only minutes. The judge denied release due to the seriousness of the crime and the strength of forensic evidence. Breckner's public defender sat silent as the charges were read. When asked if he understood them, he nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge's gavel echoed, solid and final. Draper watched from the back of the courtroom. It wasn't satisfaction she felt, more an exhausted stillness. Justice, yes, but too late for the ones who deserved it most. Outside, reporters surrounded her instantly. "Lieutenant Draper, How does it feel to close one of Akron's oldest murder cases? It's not about closing, she said firmly. It's about remembering. A young woman died, and her story deserves to be finished. Do you believe Thomas Breckner is remorseful? Her jaw tightened. He's lived 50 years free. Figure out for yourself what remorse looks like. Later that afternoon, Draper sat alone in her office. The rain clouds had cleared, leaving a dull sunlight spilling through half-open blinds. On her desk lay 2 photos, one of Karen Ellison smiling in her diner uniform, and one cropped from Breckner's driver's license. 2 lives separated by time, now permanently linked by truth. Kramer knocked lightly before stepping in. "Media's a circus out there," he said. "They're calling it the ghost case of Akron." She gave a dry half-smile. "They always need a title. They can keep the drama. I'll take the paperwork." He leaned against the door. "You did good, Emma. This one mattered." She nodded quietly. "They all matter. This one just took longer to listen." By early evening, the entire city seemed to know. The evening news replayed archival footage from 1975 beside the modern arrest. Old photographs surfaced, grainy shots of detectives at the original crime scene, Karen's high school yearbook photo, newspaper headlines that once screamed murder at the river trail. For those who'd lived through it, the memories clawed their way back like old wounds reopened. One of those people was David Ellison, Karen's younger brother. At 68, he had grown into a quiet man who'd spent most of his life trying not to remember. When the news reached him, he sat in silence in his Cleveland apartment. The reporter's voice blurred over the sound of rain against his window. "They caught him," he whispered. His wife glanced up, startled by the tone, equal parts disbelief and release. After all this time, they actually caught him. The next morning, he called the Akron Police Department. Draper answered the call herself. "My parents never got to hear this," David said gently. "But thank you. It means more than you'll ever know." Draper swallowed hard. "Your sister's case haunted this department for 50 years. She never stopped mattering." He paused. "Will I have to see him?" "In court." "Yes," she said softly. "But you won't be alone." The first court appearance took place on October 6th. The courtroom was full. Retired officers, local journalists, curious citizens. Breckner sat motionless as the prosecutor read the charges aloud. When asked to enter a plea, his voice was faint but clear. "Guilty." The admission silenced the room. The prosecutor looked stunned. Even Draper felt her gut tighten. It wasn't strategy or defiance. It sounded like surrender. Judge Hall adjusted her glasses and studied him. "You understand what that means, Mr. Breckner?" He nodded. "I've understood for 50 years. Gasps moved through the crowd. Draper kept her focus on him, searching for something in his expression, a trace of regret, or maybe just recognition that this was where the story ended. But his face gave nothing back. Outside the courthouse, the crowd seemed unsure how to react. Some cheered, others cried. One older woman laid a single white flower on the courthouse steps. The moment carried no celebration, only solemn finality. Reporters turned their attention to Draper again. "Do you feel justice was done?" one asked. She looked up at the overcast sky. "Justice doesn't erase history," she replied. "It just reminds us not to repeat it." As cameras flashed, she walked away, the echo of her boots fading across the wet concrete. That night, back at her apartment, Draper sat by the window with a mug of coffee gone cold. Outside, the city lights shimmered across the wet streets, the same city Karen had walked through 50 years ago on her final night. Draper wondered what that young woman might have dreamed about as she left work, how much life was stolen before it began. And she thought of Breckner, sleeping now in a cell for the first time in his life, his vanished decades colliding with memory. It was strange, she realized, how justice never felt like victory, only quiet consequence. She turned off the light, leaving the case folder closed on her table. In the reflection of the window, she saw her own face beside Karen's photo resting on the desk. 2 women separated by time, bound by truth. The rain began again, soft, steady, like a heartbeat echoing through the streets of a city that had finally stopped holding its breath. In the weeks following the arrest, Akron found itself caught between disbelief and fascination. 50 years had passed since Karen Ellison's death, yet suddenly her name was everywhere. On news broadcasts, in conversations at diners, in the tired voices of residents who had quietly carried the memory of her murder like a scar they could never remove. Lieutenant Emma Draper spent most of those weeks surrounded by old files. The case might have been legally solved, but for her, it still needed to make sense in every possible way. The prosecution demanded precision, every connection documented, every sample properly retested. Inside the evidence room, time seemed frozen. The walls smelled of metal and dust, the hum of fluorescent lights constant. Draper stood over a steel table where the evidence from 1975 lay in neat rows, each label handwritten, each tag marked with the initials of detectives long gone. She knew every item by heart now. The torn blouse, the dirt samples, the small white bag containing a single Viceroy cigarette, but that had survived half a century without losing its truth. She lifted that bag carefully, turning it in the light. Through the cloudy plastic, she could see the faint imprint of ash. One careless exhale in the dark had become the reason the dead could finally speak. "You waited long enough," she murmured. The forensic lab was quiet when she met with Dr. Elena Ruiz, Akron's lead DNA analyst. On the table between them were racks of labeled vials and magnified images showing DNA strands glowing blue on a digital display. Ruiz's steady hands traced the glowing lines with a stylus. "This profile is clean," Ruiz said. "No contamination, no gaps." Even after 50 years, the preservation was near perfect. His genetic markers appear on the cigarette and the fabric fibers from the victim's collar. Draper nodded, though the confirmation didn't surprise her anymore. "And the soil compounds?" Ruiz pointed to a chart. Traces of industrial lubricant mixed with clay, the type used for machinery maintenance in the 70s. "I ran a composition analysis. It matches samples from Summit Machine Works, where Breckner worked." "So he carried his job on his shoes," Draper said quietly. "Exactly. The trail tells its own story. The cigarette, the soil, the fibers, they all line up. The evidence is stronger than his confession." Draper studied the glowing images one last time. "Then it's ready for court." Ruiz looked up. "You ever think about how many others are still waiting in boxes like this?" Draper exhaled slowly. "More than I'd like to admit." The prosecutor's conference room filled with documents and photographs the following morning. Draper, the DA, and two assistants spread everything across a long wooden table, each image printed in color, mounted on stiff boards. "The jury won't have to guess," the DA said, tapping the board showing the recovered cigarette and Breckner's DNA sequence beside it. "Science doesn't age. It only sleeps." "His lawyer may argue contamination," one assistant warned. "They can try," Draper said, sliding another photo forward, a crime scene map with measured distances. Preservation procedures from 1975 are documented. The evidence chain was never broken. The DA smiled faintly. Some detectives back then did things right, even if they didn't know how much it would matter. They worked through every detail. The gas station witness statement, the autopsy report scans, the photographs recovered from newspaper archives showing officers by the river 50 summers ago. Draper traced her finger along the image of Karen's purse lying half open in the dirt. "Every single thing," she whispered, "finally means something again." On the day of the pretrial evidence hearing, the courthouse overflowed. The public couldn't resist seeing the ghost of 1975 brought back into light. The prosecutor presented methodically. One by one, the photos appeared on the screen above the jury box. Karen's route home marked in red, the cigarette labeled item number 12, the lab slide glowing with matched genetic markers. Each image pulled the courtroom deeper into a story frozen in time. When the cigarette photo appeared, a hush fell over the crowd. The prosecutor's voice echoed clearly. "This is not just evidence, it is time itself, sealed and silent until modern science could open it again." Across the aisle, Breckner sat motionless beside his attorney. His expression barely changed as the evidence streamed by. Only once did his hand twitch when the prosecutor mentioned the soil compounds found on the blouse matching lubricant from Summit Machine Works. The judge listened without interruption. When the presentation ended, she nodded. The record will show conclusive physical evidence supporting the defendant's confession. The gavel struck. The sound carried through the chamber like an old echo returning home. Afterward, Draper walked outside into a cold October breeze. Reporters lined the courthouse steps. Microphones pointed like arrows. She stopped only briefly when one woman asked, "Lieutenant, do you believe justice was finally served?" Draper glanced at the gray sky. "Justice isn't about endings," she said. "It's about truth not staying buried." The microphones lowered as she walked through the crowd. Somewhere behind her, church bells chimed noon. That evening, she drove to the Cuyahoga River. The trail had changed, new pavement, restored benches, trimmed trees, but the sound of the water was the same. A few flowers had been left near the spot where Karen's body was found, their petals damp from the autumn drizzle. Draper crouched down and placed a single white lily beside them. She didn't pray. She merely whispered, "We found him." We listened. The wind picked up, carrying the river's soft hum through the trees. The next week, the prosecutor called to confirm the sentencing hearing date. "He'll likely spend the rest of his life in prison," he said. "Life for 50 years of silence," Draper replied. "Seems balanced enough." "Balanced," he echoed, "but never fair." When the line went dead, she sat back in her chair, staring at the evidence board still pinned on her office wall. In the center was Karen's photograph, her smiling eyes surrounded by lines of tape connecting every clue. Draper realized she wasn't just looking at one tragedy. She was looking at time itself, how it shapes guilt, how it never forgets. The clock on her desk ticked softly. Outside her window, Akron's lights flickered against the dark river below. She thought again of that cigarette left smoldering in the summer of 1975, how one careless second had burned through 50 years of silence. Now at last the smoke had cleared. When the verdict became public, Akron changed overnight. What had once been a city that whispered about the River Trail murder suddenly found itself speaking the name Karen Ellison out loud again. For weeks, her photograph appeared in shop windows, at bus stops, even taped to light poles like a vigil 50 years late. The story everyone thought they had forgotten was suddenly everywhere. For many, it wasn't relief they felt, it was confrontation. Older residents, who had raised their children in the shadow of that fear, remembered the sleepless nights of 1975. They had lived through warnings, curfews, and uncertainty. And now the man responsible turned out to have lived quietly among them all along. At the Morning Star Diner, just 5 blocks from the old Benny's Cafe, where Karen once worked, conversation returned to whispers over coffee mugs. "He fixed my car once," one patron said. Seemed normal. Another shook her head. "You never really know what people carry inside, do you?" The television behind the counter replayed footage from the courthouse. The gray-haired man in cuffs, the gasps from onlookers, the rain that seemed to fall just as the gavel struck. Lieutenant Emma Draper avoided public interviews for a while. She preferred to listen quietly to what people said among themselves. To her, this reaction was part of justice too. Healing didn't come from headlines. It came from conversation. One afternoon, she stood near the river trail alone. The city had placed a small memorial marker near the spot where Karen was found. Someone had left flowers, and below them, a handwritten note read, *, "We remember you now." *. The air was cool, sharp with the scent of damp leaves. Draper looked out at the slow-moving water. The city was learning how to look its past in the eye. And that, she thought, was what justice really looked like. Across town, David Ellison became the reluctant face of the community's healing. The media called him the brother who never stopped waiting, though he had spent decades trying to live beyond that tragedy. He attended the sentencing hearing quietly, hands clasped. When reporters asked for comment after the judge's decision, he gave a simple answer. Forgiveness isn't possible, but peace might be. In the days following, residents sent letters and flowers to his home. Strangers wrote about how they had lived in fear that summer. Some included pictures of Karen clipped from yellowed newspapers, folded neatly as if returning them to him after all these years. He answered as many as he could. Every message, he told one journalist, feels like a piece of her coming home. The city council decided to honor Karen's memory officially. They named the renovated walking path along the Cuyahoga the Ellison Trail. The announcement drew a crowd that bright Saturday morning. Draper stood among them, blending in with the coats and umbrellas, listening to the mayor's speech. She became a story that warned an entire generation, the mayor said. But now, she's the story that proves patience is stronger than silence. A moment of quiet followed as David stepped forward to cut the ribbon. He looked out over the faces in the crowd, some young, some who had been alive the night she died. "My sister loved this river," he said softly. "She'd be glad people walk here again without fear." Applause spread gently through the breeze. Children ran ahead on the trail afterward, laughter echoing where silence had once lingered. Draper watched them for a while, smiling faintly. It felt right, the sound of life where death had once claimed space. Over the next few months, the Ellison case took on a new role in Ohio law enforcement training. The cold case unit used it as a case study, proof that persistence and proper evidence preservation could move time itself. Draper was invited to guest speak at the academy. Standing before a class of young recruits, she told them what she'd learned. "When I found the file," she said, "I saw more than a case. I saw a promise that what's buried isn't gone. Evidence doesn't fade. People just stop looking. So keep looking." Afterward, a young detective approached her. "How did you keep from giving up on something so old?" he asked. "I didn't know that it would work," she replied. "But I knew I couldn't let it stay forgotten." As winter came, the city's conversations mellowed. The story that once dominated headlines had become part of Akron's identity, not just a tragedy, but a measure of endurance. In cafes, people still mentioned her name, but now with gentleness instead of dread. Breckner's face faded from television screens. The world had moved on, but inside the walls of the state prison, he spent his days quietly, rarely speaking. Reports from corrections officers described him as compliant and introverted, spending hours staring at the window of his cell. He wrote one letter to the court a month after sentencing. It was short, only 4 lines. Asterisk, "I see her every night when I close my eyes. I pray she knows I'm sorry. I should have confessed long ago." Asterisk. The letter was filed, but it never reached the family. Draper read it once, sighed, and placed it back into the record. "Too late," she whispered. Apologies don't age well. On December 18th, snow fell over the city for the first time that winter. Draper drove through the sleeping streets toward the river trail. She parked by the bend where the new memorial sign stood shining under lamplight. Snow gathered on the letters of Karen's name. She thought about how fragile memory was, how easily it could have vanished if one officer in 1975 hadn't sealed that cigarette in the evidence bag. Every act of care, every small habit, had built the ladder that brought them here. She stayed there for a while, breathing in the cold air. Somewhere nearby, a train passed over the bridge, its horn echoing over the frozen river. Time kept moving, steady and unstoppable. But for the first time, Akron seemed at peace with that motion. When she finally turned to leave, Draper looked back once more at the riverbank and murmured, "We did it, Karen. You're part of us again." The snow thickened, erasing her footprints as she walked away. The city slept beneath it, cleansed but scarred, quiet but alive. And down by the frozen water, where truth had once hidden for 50 years, the lilies left by strangers stood untouched beneath a thin layer of snow, small, bright, and finally free. Winter tightened its grip on Akron as the trial began. The courthouse sat under a pale sky, its stone facade streaked with ice. Reporters clustered at the entrance, their voices muffled by scarves and clouded breath. 50 years after the night Karen Ellison died, justice was no longer a headline. It was on the docket. Lieutenant Emma Draper arrived before dawn, coat dusted in frost. She avoided the cameras, slipping quietly through the side entrance. Months of preparation had led to this, yet she still felt that familiar pull, the weight of a story too heavy for one courtroom. Inside, the lights glowed harshly on polished wood. As the gallery filled, she scanned the crowd for David Ellison. He sat near the front beside his wife, face solemn, hands folded. Draper gave a slight nod. It wasn't comfort, but acknowledgement, a promise kept. When Thomas Breckner entered, the room stilled. Shackled but calm, he looked smaller than he had in photos. No one spoke. He moved like a man who already knew his fate. The opening statement from the prosecution was quiet and deliberate. This case, the district attorney began, is proof that truth has no expiration. The evidence preserved by chance and pursued with persistence tells us not only who committed this crime, but how long we've waited to hear him admit it. The defense kept their argument measured. Breckner's attorney called him a man haunted, claiming age and frailty as mitigating factors. He is not the same person he was in 1975, the lawyer said. Whatever impulse ruled that moment has long since died. But remorse was not enough to erase the facts. Dr. Elena Ruiz took the stand first, explaining the meticulous process that verified DNA from the cigarette. No contamination, she repeated. No degradation. A perfect match. The cold objectivity of science, cut cleaner than any emotion. Next came the physical evidence. The blouse fibers, the soil compounds, the witness accounts resurfaced from decades past. Each photograph shown on screens pulled the courtroom back through time. People leaned forward, as if glimpsing Akron's buried memories flicker to life. When the image of the cigarette but appeared, the room fell silent. Draper saw David Ellison clench his fists gently on his knees. She thought of how long he'd waited to look at that proof, one careless object linking everything together. On the third day of testimony, Draper herself was called. She spoke plainly, her voice steady, describing the moment she reopened the case. It wasn't fate, she said. It was focus. The answers were always waiting, they just needed attention. The prosecutor asked what moved her most. Draper glanced toward David Ellison before replying, realizing that a daughter's story had outlasted those who forgot to keep asking questions. When she stepped down, a quiet murmur passed through the room, not applause but respect. Then came a moment everyone waited for, Breckner's turn on the stand. He rose slowly, his steps unsure. His lawyer guided him toward the microphone. For a long time, he said nothing, just stared at his hands. Finally, in a low voice, he spoke. I've replayed that night more times than I can count. I was angry. Not at her. At life, at work, at everyone. She was just there. I stopped her, tried to talk. She screamed, and I panicked. After that, he paused, exhaling heavily. I spent 50 years pretending to be someone who deserved peace. I didn't. The courtroom stayed hushed. The prosecutor asked the question everyone already knew. Did you mean to kill her? No, he said. But I did. His words hung heavy. No one moved. Even the judge kept her gaze down for a few seconds before nodding grimly. Closing arguments arrived on the sixth day. The prosecutor stood before the jury, voice strong. This case reminds us that time does not heal all wounds. It only hides them until someone cares enough to uncover the truth. The defendant lived half a century surrounded by his own silence. Karen Ellison never had that luxury. The defense urged compassion. He's an old man, the lawyer said. He has confessed. What more can punishment achieve? The jury listened in silence. Then they filed out, carrying 50 years of echoes with them. Hours passed. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the courthouse steps in white. Inside, the low murmur of voices faded as people waited for the verdict. When the jury returned, every sound vanished. The forewoman stood, paper in hand. On the charge of second-degree murder, she said, we find the defendant, Thomas Breckner, guilty. The courtroom exhaled as one. David Ellison closed his eyes. Draper felt her throat tighten, not with victory, but with release. The wheel that had been turning for half a century had finally stopped. Judge Hall leaned forward. Mr. Breckner, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. No outbursts followed. No applause. Only stillness as the gavel struck its final note. When it was over, Breckner turned once toward David Ellison. For a moment, time seemed to pause between them, the murderer and the brother of the girl he'd taken. "I'm sorry," Breckner whispered. David replied quietly, "I know. But I can't forgive you." Officers led him away, his footsteps echoing down the hall until they disappeared. Outside the courthouse, snow continued falling. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions Draper had no intention of answering. She walked down the steps in silence, snow gathering on her coat. Across the street, the river curved behind the buildings, faintly visible through falling flakes, a reminder of where it all began. Kramer caught up beside her. "It's done," he said softly. "Nothing's ever done," she replied. "It just settles for a while." They stood together as the courthouse bell tolled noon, the sound carrying through the cold air. In the distance, people gathered along the Ellison Trail, lighting candles that flickered in the snow. Draper watched them with quiet awe. Each flame shimmered against the dark river, a constellation of memory burning through 50 years of silence. Akron was still cold, still scarred. But for the first time since that terrible summer night, it also felt alive, breathing beneath the snow, holding both pain and peace in equal measure. Justice had arrived, not as thunder, but as the soft sound of voices finally saying her name. Karen Ellison, remembered, at last. When the echoes of the verdict finally faded, Akron felt different. The winter air held a strange calm, as if the city itself were learning how to rest. The story that had once haunted generations now lingered like a faded photograph, still visible, still heavy, but no longer choking the air. Lieutenant Emma Draper drove home from the courthouse in silence that night. Snow blanketed the streets, softening the lights that glowed in windows. For weeks she had lived inside this case, breathing its history, stitching together decades of silence. And now it was over. Or, at least, as over as truth ever gets. At a red light, she glanced out at the empty sidewalks, the same streets Karen must have walked down 50 years before. The stoplight reflected faintly across the windshield, tinting the world in red for a heartbeat, then green again. She drove on, thinking about how easily small moments decided everything. News of the verdict stretched beyond Ohio by morning. National outlets picked up the headline, * cold case cracked after 50 years. Akron man sentenced in 1975 murder. * anchor voices spoke of justice delayed, of new technology, of the aging killer. But beneath the broadcast rhythm, there was something gentler, a collective sigh that came when the long-forgotten finally found their names again. At the Ellison Trail, visitors began leaving flowers against the memorial plaque. Some left notes in plastic sleeves, apologies, prayers, memory fragments written by strangers who felt the loss like it was their own. The city cleaned the path weekly, but the flowers never stopped. David Ellison visited one morning just after dawn. The snow had thinned to frost, and the river ran dark beneath sheets of ice. He stood alone, gloved hands resting on the railing, and spoke softly to the quiet air. "You're free now, Karen," he said. "I think we all are." Inside prison walls 2 counties away, Thomas Breckner moved silently through his days. He ate little, spoke even less. Guards said he kept himself, often staring at the narrow window of his cell for hours. Once, a chaplain stopped by and found him sketching the outline of a woman's face on scrap paper. When asked who she was, he answered, "Someone I should have walked away from." He never asked for appeals. He never wrote to the court again. The man who had once hidden behind decades of noise now existed inside silence, the same silence he'd forced upon the city for half a century. When he died in his sleep 2 winters later, few noticed. The prison record simply listed, Thomas Breckner, deceased, natural causes. There was no family visitation. His ashes were stored, unclaimed, in a state facility. Draper received the call during her morning coffee. She didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally set the phone down, she looked out at the snow falling through gray light. "So it's done," she murmured. But even as she said it, she knew justice doesn't erase what came before. It just leaves space for peace to grow. By spring, the Ellison Trail had become part of Akron's routine landscape. Joggers passed the river each morning. Children tossed breadcrumbs to ducks. Couples held hands as they crossed the wooden bridge at sunset. The dark edge of that summer night had finally faded under ordinary life. A local reporter asked Draper for one final comment for the anniversary piece. She agreed, but refused to do it on camera. Instead, she met him at the trail, standing beside the water. "What does this case mean to the city now?" he asked. Draper looked toward the rippling surface. "It means the truth waits," she said. "Even when people stop looking, it waits. And usually that's enough." "Do you think it brought closure?" he pressed. She gave a faint smile. "There's no such thing. There's only understanding. That's what we got." Her interview ran the next day, tucked between headlines about politics and weather. But for the people of Akron, those quiet words mattered more than any front-page headline. Summer came again. July 18th marked 51 years since Karen's death. Dozens of people gathered by the river for a small memorial. No podiums, no speeches, just candles, flowers, and silence. David Ellison stood at the front beside Draper, both of them holding white lilies. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the crowd placed their flowers in the water, watching them drift downstream like fragile promises. "You ever think she knows?" David asked softly. Draper didn't answer at first. She watched the lilies spin and fade into the dark. "I think remembering her this way is how we tell her," she said finally. "Every time we say her name, we send it somewhere she can hear." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll keep saying it." That night, back at home, Draper opened the case file one last time. The edges were worn, the staples loose from too many hands. She slid a final note inside before sealing it for archive. Asterisk, justice served, October 2025. Case closed, asterisk, but below that, she penned 3 more words. She mattered always. She locked the file away, turned off the light, and stepped outside onto her balcony. The city lights shimmered along the Cuyahoga like a trail of embers. Somewhere below, the river whispered exactly as it had in 1975, unchanged, eternal, patient. Maybe that's what truth was, she thought. Not a shout, not a miracle, but a quiet current waiting to be noticed. She closed her eyes and listened. And for the first time in 50 years, Akron listened with her. The wind carried the faintest scent of rain. The river moved steadily toward the horizon, and in the stillness that wrapped around the sleeping city, Karen Ellison's name lingered, not as a headline or a haunting, but as part of the place itself. Alive in memory. Finally home.
For years, these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.